In 1949, the average Chinese person earned less per year than someone in Ghana. China's GDP per capita was $54, about the same as medieval Europe. Life expectancy was 36 years. Most people couldn't read. The country had just endured a century of wars, famines, and foreign occupation. China was, by every measure, a failed state, one of the poorest, weakest nations on Earth. Today, just 75 years later, China is the world's second largest economy. They've lifted 800 million people out of poverty. They're America's only real rival for global superpower status. Shanghai looks like something from a science fiction movie. This transformation is the fastest economic rise in human history. Nothing even comes close. But here's what most people don't understand. China's comeback wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, calculated, and it was driven by one thing above all else: a collective national memory of humiliation so deep that an entire civilization became obsessed with making sure it never happens again. This is the story of how China rebuilt from total collapse, and why they'll do anything to stay on top. To understand China's rise, you first need to understand China's fall. Because the Century of Humiliation isn't just history. It's the psychological foundation of modern China. Let's go back to 1839. At this point, China was still the world's largest economy. The Qing dynasty had ruled for nearly 200 years. China saw itself as the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization, superior to all other nations. And then the British showed up with opium and gunboats. Here's what happened. Britain had a trade problem. They wanted Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. But China didn't want British goods. So Britain was hemorrhaging silver paying for Chinese exports. Britain's solution? Start smuggling opium, grown in British-controlled India, into China. Get millions of Chinese people addicted. Create artificial demand. When China tried to stop this drug trafficking, Britain declared war, twice. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, and Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, were catastrophic for China. British gunboats destroyed Chinese coastal defenses. British troops occupied cities. And China, despite having a population 50 times larger than Britain, couldn't fight back effectively. Why? Because while China had abandoned technological development, Britain had industrialized. British steamships moved faster than Chinese junks. British rifles and artillery were far superior to Chinese weapons. China's military technology was centuries behind. China lost both wars, and the consequences were devastating. The Treaty of Nanking, 1842, forced China to pay massive reparations, opened treaty ports to foreign trade, and cede Hong Kong to Britain. Chinese sovereignty meant nothing. But it got worse. Other European powers saw China's weakness and pounced. France, Germany, Russia, Japan, everyone wanted a peace. China was carved into spheres of influence, where foreign powers controlled Chinese territory and extracted wealth. In 1860, British and French troops looted and burned the Old Summer Palace in Beijing, one of China's greatest architectural treasures. They stole artifacts worth billions in today's money. Some are still in European museums. In 1895, Japan, a country China had historically considered inferior, defeated China in war and seized Taiwan and Korea. Then came the absolute low point, the Boxer Rebellion of 1900. Chinese nationalists tried to expel all foreigners. An international coalition of 8 nations invaded Beijing, crushed the rebellion, and forced China to pay 450 million taels of silver. Roughly $333 million then, about $10 billion today. China went from being the world's dominant civilization to being a semi-colonized, carved-up territory that couldn't defend itself. And it wasn't over. The 20th century brought more disasters. The fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, warlord chaos, Japanese invasion in the 1930s, World War II, and then a brutal civil war between the nationalists and communists. By 1949, when Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China, the country was devastated. And Mao's first words were significant. The Chinese people have stood up. That phrase, stood up, meant something specific. It meant, we're not on our knees anymore. We're not weak anymore. The humiliation is over, but the question was, how do you rebuild from nothing? Here's the uncomfortable truth. China's first attempt at rebuilding was a catastrophe. Mao Zedong believed he could industrialize China through sheer willpower and revolutionary fervor. His approach was simple: copy the Soviet Union's command economy model, reject capitalism entirely, and mobilize the masses. In 1958, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, his plan to transform China from an agricultural society to an industrial powerhouse in just a few years. The results were apocalyptic. Mao ordered peasants to abandon farming and work in backyard steel furnaces, melting down tools and cooking pots to meet impossible steel production quotas. The steel was useless, low quality, and unusable. Meanwhile, crops rotted in the fields because no one was farming. The Great Leap Forward caused the worst famine in human history. Between 1959 and 1961, somewhere between 15 to 45 million Chinese people starved to death. The exact number is still debated, but even the conservative estimate is staggering. Then came the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976. Mao, trying to reassert control, unleashed radical students called Red Guards to attack old culture. They destroyed temples, burned books, attacked intellectuals and teachers. Universities closed, the economy collapsed. China descended into chaos. By the time Mao died in 1976, China had actually gone backward economically. 30 years of communist rule had made the country poorer, not richer. But here's the critical point. Even during this disaster, the Chinese Communist Party never forgot the Century of Humiliation. Every propaganda poster, every speech, every policy was framed around one idea. China must become strong so it can never be humiliated again. The question was how to get strong. And in 1978, a new leader emerged with a radically different answer. His name was Deng Xiaoping, and he was about to prove that China could learn from its mistakes. Deng Xiaoping was a survivor. He'd been purged twice during Mao's Cultural Revolution. He'd seen up close how ideology without pragmatism destroys countries. When Deng took power in 1978, he made a decision that would change everything. China would embrace capitalism, without calling it capitalism. Deng's famous quote captured his philosophy. It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. Translation: I don't care if an idea is communist or capitalist. If it makes China stronger and richer, we're doing it. Here's what Deng did. Reform number 1. Special Economic Zones, 1979. Deng created experimental special economic zones in coastal cities like Shenzhen. In these zones, foreign companies could invest, private enterprise was allowed, and capitalist market principles applied. Shenzhen, which had been a fishing village of 30,000 people in 1979, would become a city of over 12 million with a GDP larger than many countries. It was proof of concept that capitalism could work in China. Reform number 2. Township and village enterprises. Deng allowed rural communities to start small businesses. Suddenly, peasants could make and sell products for profit. These small enterprises created jobs and wealth at the grassroots level. Reform number 3. Opening to foreign investment. China invited Western companies to build factories in China. The deal was simple. You get access to cheap Chinese labor, and we get your technology, your expertise, and your capital. This was the beginning of the world's factory. By the 1990s and 2000s, everything from iPhones to furniture to clothing was being manufactured in China. Reform number 4. Education and infrastructure. China invested massively in education, sending students abroad to study in Western universities, bringing back knowledge. They built roads, ports, airports, and power plants on a scale never seen before. But here's the genius of Deng's approach. He never abandoned political control. China embraced economic capitalism while maintaining authoritarian political control. This hybrid system became known as socialism with Chinese characteristics. Basically, capitalism with a communist party firmly in charge. And it worked, spectacularly. From 1978 to 2000, China's GDP grew at an average rate of 9.5% per year. That's insane! For context, any developed country would celebrate 3 to 4% annual growth. By the year 2000, China's economy had grown tenfold. Hundreds of millions of people rose out of poverty. Life expectancy doubled. Literacy rates skyrocketed. But China wasn't done. Because the lesson from the Century of Humiliation was clear. Being middle income isn't enough. China needed to be at the top. They needed to be so powerful that no foreign nation could ever dictate terms to them again. And that brings us to Phase 3, China's plan to dominate the 21st century. In 2015, China announced Made in China 2025, a strategic plan to dominate 10 high-tech industries: artificial intelligence, robotics, aerospace, semiconductors, electric vehicles, biotechnology, and more. But this wasn't just about making stuff. This was about technological independence and global dominance. Here's China's strategy. Strategy number 1, forced technology transfer. When Western companies want access to China's massive market, China requires them to partner with Chinese companies and share technology. Tesla wants to sell cars in China? Fine. But you have to build factories in China, work with Chinese partners, and eventually, Chinese companies will learn everything you know. This is controversial and arguably violates trade rules. But it's effective. China has absorbed decades of Western technology in just 20 to 30 years. Strategy number 2, massive state investment. China's government invests hundreds of billions of dollars into strategic industries. They don't care if companies are profitable short-term. They care about building long-term dominance. For example, China's semiconductor industry receives over $100 billion in government subsidies. The goal? Stop depending on foreign chips and eventually dominate chip manufacturing. Strategy number 3, Belt and Road Initiative. Starting in 2013, China began investing trillions of dollars in infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, and Europe. They're building ports, railways, highways, and power plants in over 140 countries. This isn't charity, it's strategic. These projects create dependency. Countries owe China money and rely on Chinese infrastructure. It gives China influence. It secures access to resources. And it positions China as the center of global trade, just like Britain was in the 1800s. Strategy number 4, military modernization. China is building the world's largest navy. They're developing hypersonic missiles, stealth fighters, and aircraft carriers. They're investing in space and cyber capabilities. Why? Because the Century of Humiliation taught them that military weakness invites exploitation. They're making sure they can defend their interests anywhere in the world. Strategy number 5, digital authoritarianism. China has built the most sophisticated surveillance state in history. Facial recognition, AI monitoring, social credit systems. They can track virtually every citizen. This isn't just about control. It's about making sure internal instability never again makes China vulnerable to foreign powers. Now here's where it gets interesting. China's approach is working. By some measures, China's economy is already larger than America's. They lead the world in manufacturing, infrastructure development, and increasingly in technology. Chinese companies like Huawei, ByteDance, TikTok, BYD, electric vehicles, and DJI, drones, are global leaders. China dominates the production of solar panels, batteries, and rare earth materials essential for modern technology. The question isn't whether China has rebuilt from the Century of Humiliation. They have. The question is, what happens now that they're strong again? Here's what Western analysts often miss. China's rise isn't just about economics. It's psychological. The Century of Humiliation is taught in every Chinese school. Every Chinese student learns about the Opium Wars, the unequal treaties, the foreign invasions. They see pictures of the destroyed Summer Palace. They learn about the Treaty of Versailles, where Western powers gave Chinese territory to Japan. This isn't ancient history to China. It's living memory. Xi Jinping, China's current leader, talks about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, explicitly framing China's rise as reversing the humiliation. And here's the key. China believes they're not trying to dominate the world. They're trying to restore the natural order. In their view, China was the world's leading civilization for thousands of years. The last 200 years were an aberration, a temporary humiliation. Now they're just returning to their rightful place. This creates a dynamic that worries many strategists. China may never feel secure enough to stop expanding its power. Because the trauma of the Century of Humiliation runs so deep, China's leaders believe they need overwhelming strength to guarantee it never happens again. Taiwan is the perfect example. China sees Taiwan as the last remaining symbol of the Century of Humiliation, territory separated from China during the era of foreign domination. That's why reunification isn't negotiable for China. It's not just about the island. It's about erasing the last remnant of national humiliation. Here's the uncomfortable question. What happens when a nation that experienced profound trauma becomes powerful? Do they stop at security, or do they go further? History suggests that rising powers often overreach. Britain built an empire. America built a network of global military bases. Will China do the same? The difference is that China's rise is happening much faster, 75 years from poverty to superpower. And the psychological scars from the Century of Humiliation are still fresh. So what's the lesson from China's comeback? First, national trauma shapes national behavior for generations. The Century of Humiliation ended 75 years ago, but it still drives Chinese policy today. Countries don't forget being humiliated. They spend decades, even centuries, making sure it never happens again. Second, economic systems matter, but adaptability matters more. China failed catastrophically under Mao's rigid communist system. But when Deng was pragmatic enough to embrace capitalism while maintaining political control, China soared. Ideology that doesn't produce results gets abandoned. Third, long-term thinking beats short-term thinking. China plans in decades. They invest in projects that won't pay off for 20 to 30 years. Western democracies struggle to think beyond the next election cycle. That difference matters. And finally, rebuilding from humiliation creates a particular kind of determination. Countries that rise after falling are often more aggressive, more strategic, and more unwilling to compromise than countries that were always powerful. China rebuilt from the Century of Humiliation by being smarter, more patient, and more ruthless than anyone expected. They remembered every lesson from their collapse, and they're making sure they never repeat those mistakes. In 1842, after losing the First Opium War, a Chinese official wrote, "China has been asleep for 500 years, but one day it will awaken, and when it does, the world will tremble." That day has come. China went from a failed state in 1949 to a superpower in 2024. They lifted 800 million people out of poverty, the fastest poverty reduction in human history. They built the world's second largest economy in just 75 years. But this comeback wasn't driven by economics alone. It was driven by memory, the collective memory of being humiliated, dominated, and carved up by foreign powers. That memory still shapes everything China does today, and it means China won't stop until they're certain they can never be humiliated again. If this changed how you think about China's rise and what drives them, hit subscribe. Drop a comment. Do you think China's Century of Humiliation still drives their policies today? And share this with someone who needs to understand that economics and psychology are inseparable. Because the most powerful force in history isn't money or weapons, it's the determination to never be weak again. I'll see you in the next one. On tip.